All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're taking a deep dive into the world of self-driving cars.
Sounds exciting.
But, and here's the twist, we're not focusing on the tech itself.
Oh.
Yeah, instead we're going to tackle a question that's way more complicated. Who is actually responsible when a self-driving car crashes?
It's a question that has been keeping a lot of people up at night, that's for sure.
To get to the bottom of this, we dug up this really interesting debate
Oh.
with 8 experts going head-to-head on this very issue.
Wow, must have been intense.
Oh, it was a verbal showdown for sure, with some really strong opinions on both sides, and in the end, a decisive verdict.
Can't wait to hear more about that.
What I found so interesting is how this debate goes way beyond just pointing fingers.
It does feel like it's about more than just blame.
Yeah, it really gets into how our whole relationship with machines is changing.
Right, it's like this whole new territory.
Exactly, and as technology keeps advancing, these questions are only going to get trickier.
I can definitely see that.
So let's start by diving into the argument that, yes, the driver should be the one held responsible.
Okay, let's hear it.
So this side really hammered home the point that self-driving technology, at least for now, isn't foolproof.
Yeah, we're not quite at the Jetsons level yet.
Not even close. They emphasize that most systems on the road today are level 2 or level 3,
Okay.
which means the car can handle some things, sure, but the driver still has to be on their toes, ready to take over at any second.
Right, so you can't just zone out and read a book while driving.
No, and that brings us to a really fascinating psychological element.
Yeah.
Automation bias.
Automation bias.
It's this tendency we have as humans to over-rely on technology, kind of assume that it's always going to work perfectly.
Oh, I see.
Like when you trust spell check a little too much.
Oh, yeah, and end up with some embarrassing typos.
But in the case of self-driving cars, that kind of over-reliance could have some serious consequences.
Absolutely.
The debate even brought up that Tesla crash, where a driver using autopilot hit a parked police car.
I remember hearing about that.
Even though the car had those self-driving features, the driver just wasn't paying enough attention.
It's a good reminder that driver vigilance is still so important.
Couldn't agree more. Now here's an interesting twist.
Okay, I like twists.
The side arguing for driver responsibility actually argued that holding drivers accountable would actually boost public trust in self-driving cars.
Wait, really? How does that work?
Their reasoning was that if people know they're on the hook, they'll be more careful, they'll use the technology more responsibly.
So it's like tough love for drivers.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes sense, in a way.
And of course, you can't talk about self-driving cars without talking about insurance.
That's the big question, isn't it?
Huge. Those arguing for driver responsibility acknowledge that, yeah, some folks are worried it'll cause insurance premiums to go way up, maybe even make self-driving cars too expensive for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's a valid concern.
To address that, they propose some new models, like
Oh.
usage-based insurance, where you basically pay based on how much and how safely you drive.
Interesting. So it's kind of like a pay-as-you-go model for car insurance.
Exactly. But you know what? Let's shift gears for a second.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Let's hear what the other side of the debate had to say.
The ones who are against holding the driver responsible.
Exactly. They came back with a completely different take, arguing that blaming the driver is unfair because self-driving cars are designed to minimize human error in the first place.
So they're kind of saying if the technology is supposed to take over driving, then the responsibility should lie with the people who created it, not the person just using it.
Right. They brought up that Uber accident.
Oh, right, where the
Yeah.
company accepted responsibility, not the driver.
Exactly.
They're really shifting the focus away from individual blame.
100%. They even made a comparison to airplanes.
Airplanes. Okay, I'm intrigued.
They said if a plane crashes, you don't hold the passengers responsible, right?
True.
So why should we blame the person in a self-driving car?
That's a good point.
They argued that holding drivers liable could actually backfire and make insurance premiums so high that self-driving cars become basically luxury items, only accessible to the wealthy.
Yeah, that wouldn't be good.
And they also highlighted how blaming drivers could really damage public trust in the technology.
Right, if people are afraid of getting sued, they might not want to use self-driving cars, even if they are safer.
Instead of putting the pressure on drivers, they proposed something pretty radical. Make manufacturers and regulatory bodies accountable.
Oh, wow. So a complete shift in responsibility.
Right. They emphasized the need for really strict testing, strong safety standards, clear guidelines from the very beginning.
It's like saying, let's make sure the technology itself is safe and reliable before we even put it on the roads.
And they brought up this idea that just blew my mind. What if the concept of driver becomes totally obsolete?
Obsolete. Whoa.
Imagine a world with fully autonomous cars, No steering wheel, no need for a driver at all.
It's hard to even picture that.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
Definitely makes you think about the future of transportation.
So there you have it. Both sides of this super complex debate.
It's really fascinating stuff.
Now, the moment you've all been waiting for, the verdict.
I'm on the edge of my seat.
After a lot of deliberation, the judges
Drum roll, please.
found the argument for shifting accountability to manufacturers and regulators more convincing.
Wow, so they sided against holding the driver responsible.
They did, and it's a huge decision. It shows how the legal system is really starting to grapple with these unique challenges posed by self-driving cars.
Definitely a big step forward in figuring out who's responsible in this new technological landscape.
Absolutely. But don't go anywhere. We'll be back with part 2, where we'll break down some of these arguments in more detail and explore what this verdict really means for the future of self-driving cars.
Can't wait. I'm hooked.
It's really interesting how this whole debate highlights the tension between innovation and safety.
Yeah, we're all excited about the potential of self-driving cars, but there's definitely some anxiety about the risks too.
Absolutely. And like with any new technology, there are going to be bumps in the road, literally and figuratively.
True.
One of the arguments that really stood out from the side advocating for driver responsibility was this whole thing about the levels of autonomy.
Right. They spend a lot of time talking about that.
Yeah, they really emphasize how most self-driving cars today are still just level 2 or level 3, meaning they aren't truly autonomous.
That's a really important point.
Because it means drivers are still very much involved, even when the car is handling a lot of the driving tasks.
You can't just check out mentally.
Exactly. They kept saying, until we get to level 5, which is full autonomy, drivers can't just zone out.
Gotta stay alert.
They have to be ready to take control at any moment.
And that's where automation bias comes in.
Exactly. We as humans, we tend to get a little too comfy when we rely on technology.
Oh, yeah, we just assume it's going to work perfectly all the time.
Like setting your alarm and then oversleeping because you just assumed it would go off. But with self-driving cars, that kind of lapse in attention can have much bigger consequences.
For sure.
Think about it. Automation bias can make us less aware of potential hazards, slower to react when something unexpected happens.
We might even miss warning signs from the car because we're too trusting of its capabilities.
So even with all the sensors and algorithms, our human instincts and awareness still matter.
Big time.
The Tesla crash they talked about, that's a perfect example.
Where the driver hit a parked police car?
Yeah, even though they were using autopilot, they weren't fully engaged.
It's a reminder that no matter how good the tech gets, we still play a crucial role in staying safe.
But what about that argument that holding drivers responsible actually increases public trust?
I was wondering about that. It seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does, but their point was that clear accountability makes people more responsible.
Okay, so if people know they're on the hook, legally and financially,
they're more likely to use self-driving features carefully and stay engaged.
So it's like a tough love approach to safety.
You could say that by emphasizing the consequences, you encourage people to take the technology seriously.
Interesting. It makes you wonder if stricter regulations could actually lead to safer outcomes.
Now, let's flip the script and dive into the arguments from the other side.
The ones who said it's unfair to blame the driver.
Exactly. They're really passionate about that. They said blaming the driver is inherently unfair, especially since these cars are supposed to be designed to minimize human error.
Their main message was pretty clear. If the technology is supposed to take over driving, then the responsibility should lie with the people who made it, not the person using it.
Like if you buy a new coffee maker and it malfunctions and spills coffee everywhere.
You wouldn't blame yourself for a faulty appliance.
Right, and that's the comparison they used. They said self-driving cars are like airplanes.
Airplanes.
If a plane crashes, you don't blame the passengers for not knowing how to fly.
Right, you investigate the airline, the pilots, the manufacturers.
Exactly, and they said self-driving car incidents should be treated the same way.
So they're saying it's like blaming the victim. You're using a product designed for safety.
If the technology fails, it's not your fault.
That's a pretty strong argument.
And they also brought up a big point about insurance.
Ah, yes, insurance.
They said if insurance companies start holding drivers liable for accidents involving self-driving cars.
Premiums could go through the roof.
Exactly, which could make self-driving cars unaffordable for a lot of people.
It would create a whole new barrier to access.
They imagine this scenario where self-driving cars become a luxury only the wealthy can afford.
That would definitely widen the gap between the haves and have-nots.
Think about it. Self-driving cars have the potential to make transportation safer and more accessible for so many people. People with disabilities, older adults, people who can't afford to own a car.
But if insurance costs become too high,
Those benefits would only reach a select few.
that raises a lot of questions about equity and access.
And speaking of access, let's talk about another key argument from this side. Blaming drivers could actually undermine public trust in self-driving cars.
I can see that it seems counterintuitive, but it makes sense.
We want people to trust the technology, but if they're afraid of being held liable.
They might just stay away from it altogether.
Exactly. Fear and uncertainty can be powerful deterrents. People might stick with traditional cars, even if self-driving cars are potentially safer.
So how do we encourage adoption without sacrificing accountability?
Well, they had a pretty radical solution.
Okay, I'm listening.
They said, we need to shift away from blaming individual drivers and instead focus on holding manufacturers and regulatory bodies accountable.
So make sure the technology is safe and reliable from the start.
Exactly. Their focus was on proactive prevention rather than reactive blame.
What would that look like in practice?
They talked about things like rigorous testing, stringent safety standards for self-driving systems.
So holding manufacturers to a higher standard.
Yeah, and they said regulatory bodies need to play a more active role in overseeing the development and deployment of this technology.
It's about establishing a clear framework for safety and accountability.
They even proposed creating specific regulations just for self-driving cars.
Recognizing that these vehicles pose unique challenges.
So their thinking is if we build trust in the technology itself, maybe that fear of liability wouldn't be such a big factor.
It's an interesting perspective, shifting the focus from individual blame to collective responsibility.
And speaking of responsibility, they also brought up something called usage-based insurance.
Usage-based insurance, I've heard of that, but I'm not really sure how it works.
Basically, your insurance premium is determined by how you actually drive.
So it's not just based on your age or driving history.
It uses technology to track things like your mileage, speed, braking habits.
So safer drivers would pay less.
Exactly. It's a way to encourage safe driving behavior and reward people who use the technology responsibly.
I can see how that could work. It aligns incentives and promotes safety.
It's all about creating a system that prioritizes safety and accountability at every level.
From manufacturing and regulation to insurance and driver behavior.
Each part plays a role in creating a safer and more equitable transportation landscape.
It's not just about who's responsible when something goes wrong.
It's about how we shape the future of this technology and make sure it benefits everyone.
That's a great point, and it brings us back to the heart of this debate.
Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up this deep dive into responsibility in the age of self-driving cars.
It's been quite a journey.
Yeah, we've covered so much ground, from automation bias to insurance concerns, and even a future where the word driver becomes obsolete.
It's a lot to take in.
Definitely. But let's take a step back and revisit some of those key points that really stood out.
Sounds good.
For example, remember all those real-world incidents the side arguing for driver accountability brought up?
Like that Tesla crash where the driver was using autopilot but wasn't paying enough attention?
Yeah, exactly. They use those kinds of examples to argue that if people know they're accountable, they'll be more cautious, more likely to use the technology responsibly.
It's like that old saying, with great power comes great responsibility.
But of course, the other side countered that by saying, if you emphasize fear of liability too much.
It could actually backfire and scare people away from the technology.
Right. They said people might be so worried about getting sued that they just avoid using self-driving features altogether.
Which would slow down progress.
Exactly. And they made a strong argument that the focus should be on making the technology itself as safe and reliable as possible.
So preventing accidents rather than punishing drivers after they happen.
And their analogy with air travel was pretty interesting.
You mean how they said, we don't hold passengers accountable for plane crashes?
Right. Instead, we look at things like mechanical failure, pilot error, weather conditions. And they said self-driving car incidents should be viewed in a similar way.
So focusing on the overall safety of the system, not just blaming the person behind the wheel.
Which brings us to the big issue of insurance.
Yeah, that's a tricky one.
Because if insuring companies start holding drivers liable for every little fender bender involving a self-driving car,
Premiums could become unaffordable for most people.
and that would really limit access to this potentially transformative technology.
Imagine the impact self-driving cars could have on people who can't drive themselves. Older adults, people with disabilities, those living in areas with limited public transportation.
But if insurance costs are too high, those benefits would only be available to the wealthy.
That's a really important point.
So what's the solution?
Well, the opposing side proposed two main things.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, they said we need to shift the focus of accountability
Away from individual drivers.
and onto the manufacturers and regulatory bodies.
So put more pressure on the people who are creating and overseeing the technology.
They believe those entities should be responsible for ensuring that self-driving systems are thoroughly tested and meet the highest safety standards.
Before they're allowed on public roads.
Exactly. They emphasize the need for really strict regulations and oversight.
To build public trust and ensure the safety of these vehicles.
And their second proposal involved exploring new insurance models.
Like usage-based insurance.
Right, where your premium is determined by your actual driving behavior.
So safer drivers pay less.
And drivers who engage in risky behavior pay more.
It's a way to incentivize safe driving and reward responsible use of the technology.
It's about creating a system that promotes both innovation and accountability.
So in the end, they're advocating for a pretty comprehensive approach.
One that addresses safety and responsibility at every level, from the design and manufacturing of the cars to the way we regulate them and insure them.
And the way we as drivers interact with them.
It's really fascinating to think about how all these pieces fit together.
Because it's not just about technology.
It's about how we as a society adapt to these rapid advancements and ensure they benefit everyone.
And that's what makes this topic so compelling.
It's not just about self-driving cars. It's about navigating the intersection of technology, ethics, and human behavior.
And it's about creating a future where innovation and safety go hand in hand.
I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about.
I hope so, because these conversations are so important. We all need to be informed and engaged as self-driving cars become more and more prevalent in our lives.
And who knows what the future holds, but one thing's for sure, it's going to be an interesting ride.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of self-driving cars and the complex questions of responsibility they raise.
Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.